I have to look up this Esoterica video, and yeah, there's totally a reason why there's so many videos that say stuff like this. Looks like these big religions have been duping everybody into accidentally praising reptilians. Looks like they made a bunch of cults who don't understand that by supporting these people, you're accidentally in a cult. That a lot of Christians are out here calling people talking about this stuff alien cultists. No. The people talking about aliens are just talking about the truth. But anyway.
The birth, survival, twilight, and ultimate demise of divine beings seems to follow its own evolutionary patterns, such that some gods endure without significant cultic or theological change for centuries, while others blaze onto the world stage only to burn themselves up into extinction almost as soon as they appeared. Indeed, a given god must perform a careful balancing act to persist much through human time, marked by seemingly unending upheavals. On the one hand, a divine being must have a definite enough quality to attract and maintain worshippers, and yet, at the same time, such a god cannot be so rigid or its cult so conservative that it cannot endure significant adaptation and change, the only surety of our mundane world. Too far in one direction makes a god unappealing. Too far in the other dooms them given religious fashion and change, frankly. And surely, through the eons, some gods have adapted, and many gods have gone extinct. Though one god has proven to be rather successful, oddly enough, not that that makes them a better god or even a real god, beyond all reasonable historical expectation. In fact, this god, whose simple name means something like the one that exists, emerged from the sands of Bronze Age obscurity to eventually become not just a national god, but, in the end, simply the god for the overwhelming majority of the world's population now. But just how did a tribal warrior storm god, Yahweh, go from being a god, a minor god, among gods much more ancient and much more powerful, enduring up till then at least, to simply becoming God, the sole god of all that is in the mythology of billions? If you're interested in magic and hermetic philosophy, alchemy, or Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other topics on contents and esotericism. And also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics here in esotericism, here on YouTube, freely accessible, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or with a one-time donation, with a super thanks option, or perhaps you'd buy a shirt over at our merch store on the channel. But now, let's turn to a god that all of us know of, but none of us really know much about. Yahweh, or the one that exists, the deity at the core of the Abrahamic faiths and beyond. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As you might imagine, this is an episode I've been wanting to make for a long time, and I've been absolutely dreading having to make it for even longer. The importance of an episode on Yahweh is basically self-evident, but the challenges to making it should be equally self-evident. The literature on this topic is vast, utterly vast. It's spread over a dozen or so languages, performed by ingenious specialists with an encyclopedic grasp of the material, and yet an entire argument or series of arguments can hinge on a single suffix of an inscription. I'm looking at you, Kuntelich, a Druid pronomial suffix problem. And, of course, with Yahweh being at the core of the Abrahamic religions, historicizing such a being can easily be taken as an assault on the very core of those religions. If you historicize Yahweh, everything else might just disappear into the air. And yet, that's the task at hand. So it should go without saying that virtually everything I'm going to say in this episode can and would be taken to task by an army of specialists, and can in no way taken to be definitive, because there is simply that little consensus among the specialists. But I'd rather hazard an episode on the topic than just throw my hands up and say, oh, it's utterly frustrated by the difficulty and the complicatedness and the specialization of the topic. Better, as that famous saying of Beckett goes, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. So here's to failing better in the name of public education. Also, on a personal note, using the name Yahweh is just simply an academic attempt to vocalize the name of the Israelite tribal god, and not some attempt to actually utter a magical divine name, much less take such a name in vain. In fact, public education is just about the furthest thing from my mind when I think about doing something in vain. And lastly, this is an academic channel, and I check my religious commitments at the door, and historical facts and evidence are what matter here, not my personal beliefs. And really, when we allow our faith to dictate our history, we really just betrayed both. I guess I'll just come out of the gate with it. The origins of Yahweh are utterly unknown. The name may appear first in the 14th century BCE of an enemy list of Amenhotep III, in a similar but later list in the 13th century BCE by Ramses II as the Shasu of Yahweh, or the Shasu of Yahu. It's not quite clear how that was pronounced. The Shasu were semi-nomadic pastoralists, typically associated with raiding and general big brigandry. The Egyptian name for their name actually indicates their nomadic existence, to roam about, while the name taken up into Semitic and Hebrew means something like to raid or to plunder. So there's a clue what they were. While the name Yahweh does seem to appear here, it also seems to be functioning primarily as a toponym rather than as a theonym, but that other Shasu in the list are also associated with the region of Seir, it's a mountain range in the southwestern Transjordan, is probably going to prove salient here in just a moment. Whether the Shasu were Proto-Israelites isn't clear, but it seems reasonable to think that there was probably some connection, and ditto with the Hyperu and the social then ethnic groups, the Hebrews, that began as a social group, not an ethnic group, who were also associated with brigandry. So this is a fun origin story. Israel first appears to enter history on the Merneptah stele. He's the son of Ramses II, like his 13th son, where he claims victory such that the Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. It's perhaps worth mentioning here that the Egyptian determinative on Ashkelon, Yanoam, and Gezer indicate foreign city. This is the triple mountain determinative, whereas Israel has the foreign ethnic group determinative, though, to be sure, the use of determinatives by Egyptian scribes can be all over the place, kind of arbitrary. The southerly geographic placement may also be important, though. Note that the Israelites that Merneptah claims to annihilate aren't actually associated here with the Shasu, so that's interesting. and of course their God, the God of Israel, and none of these gods is mentioned here. The first historical archaeological link between Israel and Yahweh as a god dates to much, much later in the Iron Age, where the 9th century BCE Mesha Stele, Victory Stele, brags of dragging vessels of Yahweh before Chemosh as the Moabite kingdom rebelled and escaped Amorite Israelite hegemony in the region. Thus, it seems that southern Levantine nomads and raiders were associated with Yahweh, perhaps as a kind of theological toponym, and that by the 13th century BCE, an ethnic group known as Israel, at least to the Egyptians, existed in a similar area, and that by the 9th century BCE, the Israelite house of Omri seems to have had Yahweh as an important, probably as their national god, as opposed to the Moabite Chemosh, before which those vessels, the aforementioned vessels, were dragged. Now, given the paucity of the archaeological record, which is basically that, what can we glean from our other surviving body of evidence, that is to say, Israelite literature as edited and compiled into the Hebrew Bible about the origins of Yahweh, or what we might call primitive Yahwism, or the cult of Yahweh before its assimilation into the Canaanite heartland, the Canaanite cult, and the Canaanite pantheon more generally. Now, to do this, it appears that the best methodology would be to take the earliest linguistic strata of the Israelite literature as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, especially the Song of the Sea at Exodus 15, 1-18, Judges 5, or Devorah's Song, Psalms 18, 29, 68, and Genesis 49, among other scattered memories of very linguistically archaic mentions of Yahweh and his cult. From this, a rough sketch of primitive Yahweh can be made. It appears that the deity's original heartland was Seir, Edom, Teman, with Mount Sinai actually probably originally lying in that region. Recall the Shasu of Seir earlier, that is to say the northwestern Arabian Peninsula just east of the Dead Sea. It appears that Yahweh was probably originally a warrior god, perhaps associated with raiding and women warband prophets. Further, the central manifestation of Yahweh seems to have been storms, specifically the catastrophic thunderstorms that result in the deadly flash flooding, which actually plagues that region down to this day. Petra, the same region where Yahweh may have come from, was engineered around managing just those thunderstorms. Oh, and you can see video of what those flash floods look like in that region, and they are terrifying. At some point in the late Bronze, or probably the early Iron Age, the Yahweh cult made its way into the Judean highlands, likely settling at a cult center in Shiloh. This corresponds roughly to the biblical period of the Judges. The nomadic and possibly mercantile nature, note the mention of caravans in the Song of Devorah, which is, by the way, probably the earliest text in the Hebrew Bible, of primitive Yahwehs might explain the diffusion of the cult. That is to say, it was spread through mercantile trade. This diffusion is probably overdetermined, however, especially if raiding were involved. Of course, the major historical backdrop of all of this is the Bronze Age collapse. Through the 13th century BCE, civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a cascading systems collapse. Real scary, resulting in mass migration from the Aegean, i.e. the Sea Peoples, imperial border regression and local hegemony collapse on the part of the various empires, especially the Egyptians, imperial collapse, just full-blown civilization collapse for the Hittites and the city-state of Gerar, and generalized urban disintegration, note at a site like the city of Gezer. In fact, it may be that the conditions of the Bronze Age collapse allowed for the power vacuum in which, one, raiding as a means of survival would have emerged, and a raiding cult headed by a warrior raiding god like Yahweh might have proven pretty popular in the chaos. I mean, imagine what kind of religions would emerge in the world of Mad Max or something like that. Though this is just speculation, and that disruption in the Bronze Age collapse is probably what allowed the various states to revolt, resulting in Merneptah putting them down. But also, especially the collapse of Egyptian hegemony in the region, and this is very important. This would have allowed de facto independence, especially in the Canaanite highlands, because who wants to go up there? And it isn't surprising to me that Yahweh's cult and its military, political, state-building wing would settle in relatively remote Shiloh, before spreading north and south into the highlands and then pushing west down into the Shvela to contest eventually with the Sea People, who also got a foothold in former territory of Egyptian hegemony. This, of course, is the Peliset, as we know them from the Egyptian literature or from the Bible as well. You guessed it, the Philistines. Thus, by Iron 1, or roughly around 1200 to 1000 BCE, Yahweh had probably come to settle in the Canaanite highlands, thus marking the end of primitive Yahwism and the beginning of an incredibly complex process by which elements of Canaanite religious and cultic systems would be negotiated with both the cult but also the very divine person of Yahweh through a process of theological convergence and assimilation, divergence and cultic antagonism, and especially early monarchic syncretism. To appreciate this process, it's best to explore this complex dialectic on two axes, one being the Canaanite pantheon itself, but the other being the progression through time from the period of the Judges and through the monarchy's complex cultic relationships marked by syncretism in the north primarily, but more punctuated by Yalu monolatry in the south before the eventual transition to monotheism in the exilic and really the post-exilic period. So let's begin by exploring the dynamics of theological convergence and divergence, or cultic antagonism, with the Canaanite pantheon and Yahweh. Most of our knowledge of the Canaanite pantheon stems from the discoveries of vast royal libraries of the city of Ugarit, another victim of the Bronze Age collapse. What has emerged from this center are significant collections of mythological and cultic documents deeply detailing the nature, personalities, and mythic deeds of the various Canaanite gods in that pantheon. Though two caveats are perhaps in order. The first is that this trove may represent a specifically royal, specifically Ugaritic expression of the Canaanite theology and its myth cycles. The second is that these documents date to the mid-12th century at the latest. The city itself was probably destroyed around 1185 BCE, which is hundreds of years and still quite a distance away from the locus classicus of the development of the Israelite cult down a good bit southerly in the highlands. Thus, we don't know to what degree the Canaanite cult expressed itself specifically in that region, down in the highlands, and this is especially true because the Canaanite written record in that area is remarkably poor. It's basically non-existent. So, to what degree can we take the Ugaritic text to be representative of southern Highlander cult? Not clear. But those caveats aside, the head of the Canaanite pantheon was the grandfatherly god El, simply God. Indeed, some theories actually have that Yahweh was a local, very far southern manifestation of El, but I think that's probably doubtful. Though Deuteronomy 39 seems to be an archaic recall when Elyon, a manifestation of El, parceled out the world, providing Yahweh specifically with the lands of Jacob Israel. This is probably a rare survival from a period where Yahweh was still kind of subservient to Elyon and before theological convergence with El more generally. However, it's clear that the Yahwists were pretty comfortable enough with El to allow for significant amounts of assimilation of El features onto Yahweh, even when those features perhaps stood in significant contrast to the strident warrior of the primitive cult. One of the more striking features of these is the assimilation of El as an elderly, wise god. El is known as the father of years in any Ugaritic myth cycles, and it's perhaps this image of an elderly, white-bearded deity as assimilated onto Yahweh from Canaanite El that has probably proved the most visibly enduring and popular perception in art. If you imagine an old bearded dude as God, you're imagining El. Attached to this elder character is also El's wisdom, a trait not typically associated again with a warrior god. They don't need to be wise or smart. Further, Yahweh's partially converged as a creator deity, but only partially converged. The name Yahweh probably just meant the one that is, or he is, and was primitively not associated with creative powers. Again, warrior gods don't do much creating stuff. In the verbal form to twist his name, Yod He Vav He, into a creative form, the verbal form that we know as the Hifil in Hebrew, It never appears in Israelite literature. Thus, it's unsurprising that a great deal of the creative work in the Bible is typically associated with the divine names like El, and especially Elohim. Even note a name like Elkanah, El creates, never really appears with a Yahwistic theoform. We never get a Yahwistic version of that name. Thus, we have a situation where not only are elements of El assimilated to Yahweh, but that the early Israelites were even comfortable enough with a theological identity made between the two. They combine El and Yahweh. It's very clear in the Hebrew Bible. Thus, many elements of Canaanite El, though not all of them, definitely not all of them as we'll see in a moment, are assimilated to Yahweh, or, with the identity being established, the powers and features of El de facto become those of Yahweh. An element of this transfer, especially in the earlier period, was El's divine council, including a retinue of quasi-divine bureaucrats such as the prosecuting attorney Ha-Satan, but also the military leader, the Sar Tzava, but also including the 70 sons of El, or Elyon. Of course, these sons would also later become demoted to angels as monotheism took root before descending to earth to mate with human women in Genesis 6, and all that gets developed, of course, in the book of Enoch. Though, like creation, this assimilation of the divine council was not total. The sons always appear as sons of El, the divine appellation there, never the sons of Yahweh. Though, along with these originally quasi-divine beings would also come an entire retinue of celestial objects, because the sky, especially things like stars, the sun, and the moon, that were all worshipped in the region as well. One of those beings, Halel ben Shachar, probably Venus, appears in the divine council as a kind of insurgent upstart cast down to Canaanite Sheol, the underworld of the Israelites, and an oracle against a king of Babylon, probably Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, this character would later go on to become modified in Christian mythology to become the satanic Lucifer in that tradition, showing just how long of a half-life these beings can have. That being goes all the way back to ancient Canaanite celestial mythology. Another interesting instance has a deceptive spirit, a Ruach Sheker, being recruited by Yahweh to fool some of the prophets to ensure the death of King Achav. Of course, Psalm 82 also captures this assimilation of El's divine council very clearly. He's speaking to members of the divine council, they're called gods. Perhaps the most peculiar assimilation of this to the warrior god Yahweh are actually El's traits as merciful and compassionate. This is an outstanding trait and sensible for the grandfatherly El, who even has a bit too much to drink from time to time. There are some great stories in the Ugaritic myth cycles about that, and it is an interesting but reasonable assimilation onto a god whose prehistory of warfare and brutal raiding must transition. It has to transition when you go into a more sedentary cult where, you can't solve all your problems through violence anymore, even most of your problems through violence. Thus, this results in contemporary readers' whiplash reading the Hebrew Bible, where the deity there seems to absolutely delight in wading in blood of his foes and killing people, and then you turn a few pages later, and this is a God whose mercy and compassion never fail. That's because you have two gods being welded together here who have very different traits. Of course,
Pretty much that's what the Guardian material says happened with Jesus, the stories of Jesus. That the stories of Jesus in the Bible are a blending of Jeshua 9 and Jeshua, the one that went on the cross, but and that there was a Jeshua 12 who was never wrote about, but yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, it could not be ultimately right, but it totally makes sense to me. If you don't start looking at stuff like this, you can't even imagine, like, when you actually do realize that the gods are actually what are real. And when you hear their stories, like, oh shit, that's what's real, you can't, like, even begin to process how much it feels like you're in a dryer when your brain starts tumbling through this shit. Because then the stories change again. Like, it's crazy.
Of course, not all elements of Yahweh were assimilated equally by the Israelites. One of the important epithets of El was Bull El, and bull iconography, eventually all iconography, especially in the south, was apparently polarizing among the Israelites. It appears that the northern variants of the cult accepted El Yahweh bull iconography, with Jeroboam I setting up very distinct bull imagery at his Yahweh shrines at Bethel. The name there, House of El, and Dan. Dan is the only surviving Yahweh shrine in the world, from antiquity at least, along with Tel Arad in the south, but it's mostly been deconstructed and put in the Israel Museum. These are the only two Yahweh shrines that survive into the archaeological record. Now, while this bull imagery might have been primitive to Yahweh, it's much more likely that it was a northern assimilation from the El cult, that the southern cult, by the way, preferring the ark's cherubim as its major cult symbol, but it was actually just more generally aniconic in its disposition, generally grew to detest, especially as the northern kingdom grew in power and prestige, and, well, the Amorites were very powerful, and the southerners probably felt jealous of them and hated their cows. Indeed, the golden calf narrative itself may be a southern polemic against the Norse assimilation of this dimension of El's cult, the importation of this bull imagery. Finally, El had a divine consort, Atherat, but I'll come back to her when I discuss Asherah in just a moment. If the relationship of Yahweh and El was assimilation to convergence, then the relationship with the Canaanite warrior and storm god Baal, literally the Lord, is going to be characterized by assimilation to not only divergence, but also just straight-up cultic antagonism. The discovery of the Ugaritic Baal cycle has done more to inform our understanding of the local ancient mythology of that region than perhaps any other group of texts outside, of course, from the Hebrew Bible. Here, Baal is famous for his triumphs over the chaotic forces of the sea, or Yam, his fight with death, to the death, when he subsequently resurrected and achieved detente with Mot, or the god of death, with the aid of the fierce fertility warrior goddess Anat, thus providing for the life-giving winter rains in the region before being exalted as virtually the king of the entire world. Virtually every element of the Baal cultus will intersect with Yahweh and his cult, very probably because of just how similar the deities were and how very popular Baal must have been compared with the relative upstart Yahweh in the region.
Like I said, it's literally like, for all intents and purposes, really hard to tell Yahweh and Baal apart. So it looks pretty bad. It looks pretty bad here. Makes me want to rip doors off the hinges, you know, what they've done. Super sad.